I'm reading the whole Throne of Glass series so that you don't have to. So these videos are going over the detailed plot of what happens. So instead of reading 4 to 1,000-page books, you can just watch these few hour-long videos and you know what's going on. So if this series intimidates you, then just stay tuned for my videos. Hi, welcome back. So today I'm going to be going over the plot recap for Throne of Glass. So last time I did Assassin's Blade, and you'll notice there's a bunch of characters down here underneath the map, and these were all characters that were mentioned in Assassin's Blade, but they don't pop up in this book, but they will come up later. So I just kind of stuck them down here for now. So at the beginning of this book, we start out up here in Endovier, which is kind of cut off, so I'll put a picture up here. And then we'll have in Rifthold the glass castle, and this is the clock tower in like the courtyard of the glass castle. So where we start out here is Celaena is up in Endovier. So she gets pulled out of the mines by a guard, and he kind of weaves in and out of all these hallways and stuff trying to confuse her, and ends up taking her to a throne room. So when they get to this throne room, she sees this guy sitting up on the throne, and this is Prince Dorian. And then we find out that this is Chaol Westfall. He's the captain of the guard. And then we have this jerk, Duke Parrington. So they're all there to talk to her and make a deal with her. So when they walk into the throne room, everyone bows to Dorian, but Celaena does not. So this jerk comes up and pushes her over and makes her bow. So Dorian is I don't see the point in that, because the whole point of bowing is to give someone respect. So he kind of gets on to Duke Parrington for that. We learn that when Celaena was 8 years old, Erebin found her on the banks of a river, almost frozen to death, and he took her in at 8 years old. And she's been an assassin ever since. So she's been in Endovier for a year now. We end up learning a story of when she first got there. It was a couple months in, and she ended up taking her pickaxe from the mines and killed a few guards and bolted for the wall. So she made it almost there. She was within reaching distance. She could almost touch the wall, and then they caught up to her. So we find out that generally if someone tries to escape, they don't make it 3 feet before they're shot. So she made it way farther than anybody else did. And she ends up telling him that she never intended to escape. She was hoping to be shot. So, but they had plans for her to keep her and make her suffer. So Dorian tells her, "I have a proposition for you." So she's like, "I'm listening." Basically, he tells her that the king is in need of his champion, which basically means that she'll go around and do all his dirty work for him. He tells her, well, this position isn't being offered to you. You have to compete in this competition, and there's a bunch of other champions, and you have to win this competition, and then you'll become the champion. And he's like, if you do this and you win the champion, then you'll be free in 5 years. They kind of barter back and forth, and they agree on 4 years. So if she wins this competition and becomes the king's champion and works for him for 4 years, she has her freedom. Later on, they have a big dinner or whatever, and she throws her guts up. She just can't handle the food like she used to. She's in a bed, she can't sleep, she can't get comfortable because she's used to sleeping on the floor. So she ends up moving and laying on the floor and she ends up, that's where Kale finds her in the morning. They go to the caravan, and there's some dogs that come running up to her. You know, she like bends down and she's loving on them and stuff, and Dorian's like, that's weird, normally they don't like people like that. So they kind of like banter back and forth, and then they start traveling, and by mid-morning they're in the Oakwald Forest. I have a quote here. Legends were still told of the strange and deadly people who dwelt there, the cruel and bloodthirsty descendants of the fallen witch kingdom. Then she's like trying to chat with Kale, but he makes it clear that like they're not friends, and like he thinks of her as an enemy basically. That she's a criminal and he's a guard. So they stop for lunch so that they can eat, and so he unlocks her shackles and puts them on her ankles. So she's watching Dorian and Duke Parrington, and they're kind of like, you know, there's some tension there, so she realizes like they're not friends. So we find out some background on her, that she's from Terrasen. After Arobynn adopted her, or whatever you want to call it, he would never let her go back to Terrasen. And she says, now there was nothing left for her there, nor would there ever be. So then they kind of end up talking about the Fae and like the little folk that live in the woods and stuff, and she's like, you know, the guards are joking about it, and she's like, you guys need to take this seriously, like don't anger them. And we learn, you know, like when magic disappeared, she had some magic before then, and she says that she's glad that it's gone. So the battery died. But so we learned that before magic disappeared, Celaena did have powers, and she says that she's glad that they're gone because it could have killed her by now. They travel for the day and they stop, and when she wakes up in the morning, she has gifts from the little folk, and basically it's like flowers all over at the end of her bed. They all travel for like 2 weeks, and it's cold and rainy, and she's complaining the whole time, and says she felt as though she were in a state of partial decay, and with each gust of frigid, stinging winds, she wondered when her skin would rip from her bones. And then all of a sudden, the rain stops. So then we're kind of like in her head, and she's thinking about how hot Dorian is. They're like getting close to the city, and so Dorian, Kale, and Celaena all go up to the top of this hill to like look at the castle and the city below. So they talk about the castle, and says it was gargantuan, a vertical city of shimmering crystalline towers and bridges, chambers and turrets, domed ballrooms, and long endless hallways. It had been built above the original stone castle, and Celaena thinks that it's ugly. And Dorian also says it's too much, like why would his dad do that? So then they make camp for the night, and they stay there and plan to go to the castle in the morning. So then they're talking about Celaena's time in Endovier, and she says, when I arrived, they cut my hair, gave me rags, and put a pickaxe in my hand as if I knew what to do with it. They chained me to the others, and I endured my whippings with the rest of them, but the overseers had been instructed to treat me with extra care, and took the liberty of rubbing salt into my wounds, salt that I mined, and whipped me often enough so that some of the gashes never really closed. It was through the kindness of a few prisoners from Elwë that my wound didn't become infected. Every night, one of them stayed up the hours it took to clean my back. So, you know, we know she had a really rough time there at prison camp. So the next day, they arrive at the castle, and they end up taking this long way through town, and there's people lined up everywhere, and, you know, cheering for Dorian, and just like, you know, because everybody's got the hots for him. So then we learn that the competition's going to start the next day. They take her to her rooms, and she's like terrified of the glass part of the castle, and she doesn't want to be up in it, and she's just terrified that it'll break. So Dorian had put her in the stone part of the castle. So she goes in her room, and her room has a bedroom, a bathing chamber, a dressing room, small dining room, and a music and gaming room. It had a huge bed and a giant tapestry on the wall. And then she notes that there's like 9 guards posted all around, like outside of her rooms. So she ends up digging through the room, digging through the drawers and the closet and everything, and she finds some hairpins, and she basically like makes this shiv out of them. And then she kind of notes like everything else in the rooms that she could use as weapons, and she like notes that like the billiard sticks and balls and stuff she could use as weapons. So she like naps and she bathes and she kind of gets pampered, and then we end up meeting her servant, Philippa, which I didn't do a picture of her. I probably should have, but I didn't do a picture of Philippa. So she meets her, and Philippa is like mouthy with her, and she's telling her how it is. And Celaena's basically like, how are you a servant? Like, do other people let you talk to them like that? And she's like, well, there's a reason that they put me with you. Dorian goes to see his dad. So Dorian goes to see his dad, the King of Ardalan, and I added him up here. And basically they argue about Celaena. His dad's telling him how stupid he is, basically. So then we learn that Duke Parrington is sponsoring this guy named Kane. So this is Kane. He was like a soldier, and he's been on battlefields and everything. He's just this massive brute of a guy. So these guys are still arguing about her, and he ends up talking back to his dad, and he's like, well, they're arguing. Dorian ends up saying, well, when I'm king, and that doesn't go over too well. So the king says, like, don't be courting her, like, leave her alone. So Dorian is like, well, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna throw me in the salt mines if I do? And so his dad just backhands him. So then we jump to Chaol and Celaena, and they are taking like a tour of the castle, and he's showing her around and stuff. So they end up going and seeing the clock tower that has an awful glare on it. Let me see if I can adjust this. So she notices like how weird and creepy this is. It's got gargoyles on top, and there's like weird markings on it, and there's like the weird marks on the ground too, which we later learn are called word marks. Then they're like continuing their tour of the castle, and they come across this library. She like wants to go and, you know, talks about how she loves reading and stuff, and he tells her it's the king's private library, so like you're not allowed to check out any books. So he's telling her a little more about the library, and she asks like how many volumes are there, and he says the last time anybody bothered to count, it was 1,000,000, but that was 200 years ago. I'd say maybe more than that, especially given the legends that a second library lies deep beneath the catacombs and tunnels. Which, if you've read ACOTAR, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, so then they talk about, she's from Terrasen, and in Orinth, they had this great library, and they say that it used to hold the knowledge of the world. She says that she's been there, but when she was very young, and they wouldn't let her explore because the master scholars were afraid that she'd ruin something. And she says, though a part of her savored the hope that those master scholars had smuggled many of the priceless books to safety, that when the royal family had been slaughtered and the king of Ardalan invaded, those stuffy old men had the good sense to start hiding 2,000 years worth of ideas and learning. So she's hoping that they save some of that library. So then Celaena's irritated that she can't read any books, so she ends up writing Dorian a note. It says, Your Highness, it has come to my attention that your library isn't a library, but rather a personal collection for only you and your esteemed father to enjoy. As many of your 1,000,000 books seem to be present and underused, I must beg you to grant me permission to borrow a few so that they might receive the attention they deserve. Since I am deprived of company and entertainment, this act of kindness is the least someone of your importance could deign to bestow upon a lovely miserable wretch such as I. Yours most truly, Celaena Sardathian. So Dorian ends up writing her back and says, My most true assassin, enclosed are 7 books from my personal library that I have recently read and enjoyed immensely. You are, of course, free to read as many of the books in the castle library as you wish, but I command you to read these first so that we might discuss them. I promise they are not dull, for I am not one inclined to sit through pages of nonsense and bloated speech, though perhaps you enjoy works and authors who think very highly of themselves. Most affectionately, Dorian Habiliard. So then, the next day, she wakes up to the clock tower dinging, and it's noon, and she's like, holy crap, what about the competition? Like, it was supposed to start today. So she ends up going out on her balcony, and these 3 women appear, and they're chatting and stuff. And so this raven-haired woman, okay, so this raven-haired woman, which we don't know her name yet, she's talking about Dorian. And she says, it won't take long for Dorian to ask me for a private audience, though I worry how much Parrington's courting will interfere, but I do adore the man for inviting me to Rifthold. My mother must be writhing in her grave. So basically we find out that Duke Parrington is courting her, but she's after Dorian. They start talking about the girl that he brought to Rifthold and how she's just a harlot and blah 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 blah. So Celaena's standing above him on this balcony, and she knocks a planter over and almost hits Kaltain and the other girls. So then she like runs and they can't see it. She's laughing. A little bit later on, she gets dressed up and she's like putting like pretty dresses and stuff on, and then Chaol comes to get her and he's like, holy crap, you gotta come now. We gotta go to the throne room. So he ends up telling her to behave because they gotta meet with all the competitors and stuff, and he ends up telling her, oh, you look pretty. So in this meeting with the king and everybody, we learn that there are 24 competitors. It's going to be 13 weeks. They're going to train every day and they're going to be tested once a week. So the week after Yulmus, the 4 remaining competitors will duel to win the title. So then the king dismisses them, and Dorian, Chaol, and Celaena all go out in the hallway and stuff, and they're discussing her competition and like if she's worried about anybody. Then after the fact, they tell her, oh hey, by the way, we didn't discuss the plan, but while you're here, you're gonna go by Lillian Gordania, and she's a jewel thief, and you know, you're not an assassin. So then they run into Kaltain. So we learn her name is Kaltain Rompierre, or something like that, close enough. This was Flower Pot Girl. So she flirts with Dorian while they're standing there. He kind of blows her off. So the next day, Chaol wakes her up, and she's tired and whiny and whatever, and tells him that she stayed up all night reading. So they go to the barracks, and Cain talks to her. He's kind of talking crap and whatever. So her and Chaol like sword fight and stuff, and he basically knocks her on her butt. So Cain sees this and he's laughing and smiling about it. So for the next round, she goes and grabs some like daggers, some like throwing knife type things. So just as they're about to go for round 2, a man enters and hollers for their attention. So this man is Theodas Brulo, and he's the weapons master, and he's the judge of the competition. So I didn't give him a picture either. He's not that big of a character. So we learned that he's been doing this for 30 years. So he has them go around the circle and introduce themselves, and so we find out that he was a soldier in the king's army from the White Fang Mountains. We learn about a guy named Xavier, who was a master thief of Melisande. There's 6 more soldiers, 3 more thieves, and one of these thieves is Nox Owen. So there's also 3 mercenaries, 2 murderers, Bill Chastain, which is called the Eye Eater, and Ned Clement the Scythe. There's 2 scarred silent men, 5 assassins that she said no one she's heard of except for Grave. And Grave never stops at just killing, like he's weird and messed up. There's her, Lillian, the jewel thief. So they all have to go on a run, and they're told that the first test is in 5 days. Chaol talks to her and tells her, like, stay in the middle of the pack, just be average, and don't draw any attention to yourself. So they run their little training route or whatever, and afterwards she ends up saying, oh, I dropped my ring, and she goes back to get her ring, and she ends up bending over by this tree and throwing up her guts. So at lunchtime, Brulo, which is the weapons master, releases them, and her and Chaol eat together, and they like talk about books and stuff. So then the next day, when Chaol comes to get her in the morning, she's already working out. She's exercising, trying to get in shape. Later that afternoon, these two go for a stroll around the castle, and they run into Kaltain, and she is leading this princess around. So Kaltain is leading this princess around, and we learned that her name is Nehemia. She is from Ilway, and she barely speaks any of their language. So Celaena starts talking to her in Ilway, and everybody else is like, what the hell? You know, they become friendly, and Nehemia is like, hey, while I'm here, I want to hang out with you. Like, you know, you actually speak my language. You know, they're friendly. So we continue on, and she keeps training at dawn. Her and Chaol kind of train away from the others to like keep her skills secret. So that's in the morning, and then after lunch she trains with everybody else. So basically it's a whole full day of training. The day before the first test, Bill Chastain, which is the eye eater that I mentioned, he's found dead. So they say that his body is shredded and there's like blood everywhere. So she ends up becoming kind of friendly with Nox, and they're like practicing throwing daggers one day, and she kind of teaches him what he's doing wrong and teaches him how to throw better. So later, Celaena and Chaol kind of chat, and we get to know him a little better, and he's from Aniel. His father wanted him to be on the royal council, but he did not want that. So he abdicated and became the apprentice of the captain of the guard. So she ends up telling him that her parents died when she was 8, and then he asks about a scar on her hand. So she tells him about this scar, and she says, when I was 12, Arobynn Hamel decided I wasn't nearly as skilled at swordplay with my left hand, so he gave me a choice. Either he could break my right hand, or I could do it myself. That night I put my hand against the door frame and slammed the door shut on it. I split my hand wide open and broke 2 bones. It took months to heal, months during which I could only use my left hand. I bet Brullo never did that to you. He says, no, he didn't. Here we kind of learn how messed up her childhood was with Arobynn. Like, that's the beginning of it. The next day we continue on to the first test. So it is archery, and there's 5 targets, and each one gets a little further back. They have 1 shot per each target. So Chaol is like, don't show off. She kind of does though. She like aims right outside the bullseye type stuff, and like she shoots and like it goes where she wants it to, but she doesn't want to hit the bullseye. So like, if that makes sense. So then at the end of it, this guy Pelor something like that, he kind of fails at it and tells them like his skills are in poisons. One of the soldiers is the one that gets eliminated in the archery contest. So 3 days later, and they have 4 days until the next test. She's still running with Chaol and stops to puke still. She's like still way out of shape, but like her shirt is just soaked in sweat. And Chaol notices scars on her back, and he asks like how she got them. So she says that when she arrived at Endovier, they gave her 21 lashes, and the next morning a woman ends up giving her this salve to put on it, and later that woman was raped and killed. So then the next day they all gather for this test with the weapons master. So then one of the other soldiers that's still there in the competition, he knocks a guard out and tries to run. So he's like immediately shot with an arrow. She basically thinks to herself like, you know, dying rather than playing the king's games was his only choice. So then we jump to Dorian, and he's attending his mother's court, and they kind of talk about his little brother a little bit. His little brother's name's Holland, but we don't meet him for a while, I think, until the next book. So his mom kind of like bombards him with this list of potential brides, and she's like, it's time you got married, like I want grandkids, blah 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 blah. He like gets tired of it and he leaves, and then he ends up going. So he goes and he finds Celaena practicing, and Nehemia is there watching. Dorian is trying to get Nehemia to go back to her chambers, but like Celaena is translating for them, and basically she ends up volunteering Dorian to be Nehemia's sparring partner and to like teach her how to spar. So Celaena starts watching him, and she's just thinking about, oh, how handsome he is again, and that she'd like to kiss him and blah blah blah. So then Chaol walks in and he freaks out that these two are fighting, and he's like, what the hell is going on here? So then we jump to Kaltang. So she is at the Queen's Court, and Duke Parrington comes in, and he ends up telling her about the list that the Queen gave to Dorian, and, you know, about the potential bride. So then this chick starts plotting on how she can get Dorian, like how she's gonna win him over. So then Dorian ends up asking Chaol if he likes Celaena. Chaol's like, no, I don't like her. Later on, Celaena's in her rooms, and she's playing piano and stuff, and Dorian is being a creep and standing in the doorway watching her. So he ends up startling her. He says something and freaks her out, and then they end up, like, she stops playing and they start chatting about books. So he ends up asking her how, like, her and Chaol are getting along, and she says that she thinks that he hates her. So then they end up arguing, and she tells him to leave, and then he asks her, like, oh, so when you were playing the piano, who was this mystery lover you were thinking about? And she ends up telling him about Sam, which is over here, and how he died 13 months ago. Then we cut to the next test, and Celaena here is just like dangling from a wall. There's 19 competitors left. There's one guy that didn't show up. So basically this is like a capture the flag, like they gotta scale the castle walls, and then up at the top there's like a flag they gotta get, and whoever gets there first wins. So she chooses a tin of tar and has it on her fingertips and stuff to like help climb the wall. Most of them chose like rope, and they chose like an easy route up, but she's taken like a harder route. Ned Clement ends up falling, and so then Grave and Knox are up like on this gargoyle, and Grave shoves Knox off, and he's like dangling from this rope, and Grave starts to like cut at it with a knife. And so Celaena sees this. Sorry about the background noise. There's a train going by and my air is running also. So Grave starts to cut the rope. Celaena ends up stealing another rope from a guy and like tying it around her waist, and she like dives and like swings and goes and saves him. So she ends up giving him the rope, and then goes on her way climbing up, and she comes in second to last, and of course Knox is last. But since Ned fell and died, nobody else gets eliminated. So she finds out from Philippa that the guy that didn't show up was found dead in the servants' stairwell. So at this point there's 9 weeks left until the final duel. So Celaena ends up having a nightmare that she's back in Endovir, and she wakes up, and Chaol, for whatever reason, is there, and he's like comforting her and stuff. And he's like, it's just a dream, it's just a dream. Her windows are shut, doors are shut, and everything, and for whatever reason she feels a breeze and she starts smelling roses, and she's trying to figure out where this is coming from. But so then like Chaol distracts her, and he informs her that Sam Heughan, I don't know how to say that. That's how they said it in the audiobook, Sam Heughan. So he informs her that it's Sam Heughan. So he's canceling their training for the day. She like jokingly asks him like if he's gonna summon the dead that night or like light a bonfire with his friends. And he says that he doesn't believe in that superstition stuff. And she says, be careful. The gods and the dead are closest to the earth this day. They can hear every nasty comment you make. And then they like bicker about it. He ends up telling her, you have another test tomorrow. And she's like, again? We just had one. They just had one, and it was javelin throwing on horseback. After the like holiday service or whatever, Dorian is walking the grounds and stuff, and he like rounds this big hedge and runs into Celaena. She's with Chaol and Nehemia. So basically he kind of tells her like, hey, that dress you've got on is kind of like out of date, whatever, but she's like, I like it. Then we learn that Duke Parrington has been pushing to bring more forces into Ilwe, which is where Nehemia's from. But Dorian has them convinced to like back off until his father returns, because his father's off on some mission. Then it's like 2 weeks later. They've been seeing each other a lot, Nehemia and Celaena, and you know, they've been going on walks and having dinners and stuff. So Chaol is arguing with Nehemia, and like Celaena is like, it's pointless, and she ends up telling him like, maybe you shouldn't have given up your title and gave it to Taran, which is his brother. And he's shocked that she remembers his brother's name, and she's like, you told me, why would I not remember it? So then she's thinking about how handsome he is, so she's crushing on Chaol and Dorian at this point. So then he asks if he should bring her a trinket from the like dinner that night, like the big party. She tells him like, well, as my friend, you should either keep me company or like bring me with you. And he's like, I can't do that. But he's also like, so we're friends now? And she says, well, reluctant acquaintances is more like it. So then Nehemia interrupts and she's like, hey, you can teach me. So they end up talking about Celaena they talk about Celaena teaching Nehemia their language and like how to read it and speak it and all. So Chaol is like, no, it's not happening. So then like they're walking in this courtyard with the tower, and they come across the word marks, and which at this point we don't know that they're word marks, but Nehemia tells her that's what it is. And she's like, can you read them? And Nehemia's like, no, it was an ancient religion that's been lost. So they find more, and she's like just so curious about them, and Nehemia's like, just leave it alone. And she tells her like they were forgotten for a reason. Kind of at the end of their little walk, Celaena tells Nehemia like, yes, I will teach you how to speak our language, and so meet me before supper each day. So then later, Celaena's laying there staring at the floor. So like there's a test tomorrow, she can't sleep, she's stressing out. So then she notices the tapestry on the wall is just kind of like blowing, but everything's closed. So she's like, why is that blowing? There shouldn't be a breeze. She ends up pulling the dresser out and kind of pulls the tapestry back, and she ends up finding a secret door. So she goes and finds 2 balls of yarn and some candles and some sticks of chalk and stuff, and like her little makeshift shiv knife thing, and she follows the path, and she comes across three dark portals, and she chooses to go down the middle one, and she keeps going straight past a bunch of archways, and she sees some light ahead, and she ends up coming up on like the sewers, like where it leads out, and there's some boats out there and stuff, but there's like no guards around. So she's like, hey, this could be my way out. But she ends up deciding she's not gonna run, she's gonna stay and try and earn her freedom. So she starts going back, and she gets back to the portals, and there's like a breeze to the right. She gets like, with the breeze to the right, she gets a bad feeling about it, and she decides to go to the left. So it leads her to a small hallway with a bronze grate that looks out over the feast and the great hall. And then she finds out, well, the other champions were allowed to attend, so why would she not? And then she sees Chaol get up, so she decides to go back to her room so that he doesn't catch her. Later on, after the feast, Dorian goes to Celaena's room and finds her asleep, and he's just kind of like standing there staring at her, and then Chaol comes in and he's like, what the hell are you doing here? Chaol kind of like shoves him out the door. He's a little bit jealous, but he's trying to deny it. After he kicks Dorian out, he ends up going into her room. She wakes up, if she was even asleep at all, and he gives her the ring, like this ring from the feast, which is like an amethyst ring. And then she immediately goes back to sleep. She ends up having a dream that she's walking down the passage again. She smells roses, and she goes down that right path that she was avoiding. So it leads her to a door with a knocker in the shape of a skull. So the door swings open, and there's a shaft of moonlight that's coming in through like a small hole in the ceiling, and then she sees 2 sarcophagus. So there's a man and a woman. She notices that there's trees carved in the ceiling, that both of the sarcophagi, I think it's sarcophagi, whatever, both of them have crowns on. The woman's has a blue gem embedded in the center of it. And then she's like, well, which queen were you? And she sees that there's a mark carved and it's a word mark. So she ends up tripping on something, and then she realizes the floor is covered in stars. So it's like the sky is below her and the earth is above her. She's like, that's weird. And then she notices on the bottom of the queen's sarcophagus that it says, "Ah, time's rift." So then she notices that the ears on the sarcophagus are pointy and that this woman was a fae. So she figures out that it's Gavin, the first king of Otterland, and Elena, the first princess of Terrasen, which is Brandon's daughter and Gavin's wife and queen. So she realizes that there's a sword and its name is Damaris. And she says it out loud, and then somebody says, "You know your history," and it scares the crap out of her, and she turns around and it's Elena's spirit. So Selena asks her, like, "Who are you?" And she tells her, "You know who I am." So she says, "Are you a ghost?" "Not quite. I'm not alive, but my spirit doesn't haunt this place. I've risked much coming here tonight." She's like, "Risked? I cannot stay here long, and neither can you. They are distracted for now, but..." So Selena's like, "Who needs distracting?" She said, "The 8 guardians, you know of whom I speak." She says, "The gargoyles on the clock tower?" The queen nods. "They guard the portal between our worlds. We have managed to buy some time, and I was able to slip past. You must listen to what I tell you. Nothing is coincidence. Everything has a purpose. You were meant to come to this castle just as you were meant to be an assassin, to learn the skills necessary for survival. Something evil dwells in this castle, something wicked enough to make the stars quake. Its malice echoes into all worlds. You must stop it. Forget your friendships, forget your debts and oaths. Destroy it before it's too late, before a portal is ripped open so wide that there can be no undoing it. Oh, there's no time. You must win this competition to become the king's champion. You understand people's plight. Aurelia needs you as the king's champion." And then she tells her, "Someone wants you to learn. Someone wants you to see." And then she stops and says, "They're coming." She's like, "But I'm not who you think I am." She says, "Courage of the heart is very rare. Let it guide you." And then she tells her, "Go, run." She had given her a necklace while they're talking. And so Selena gets back to her room and stuff, and then she barely makes it there, and then everything goes dark. So then later she wakes up and rolls over, and in her hand is a gold amulet. It says it's made of intricate bands of metal. Within a round border of the amulet lay 2 overlapping circles, one on top of the other. In the space that they shared was a small blue gem. It gave the center of the amulet the appearance of an eye. A line ran straight through the entire thing. It was beautiful and strange. And then she notices the tapestry is pulled aside and the door's ajar. And then she realized it wasn't a dream. She's worried about what Elena was telling her, and she's like, "Well, the least I can do is like search that tomb for answers." So then in the morning, Kale busts into her room and he's like, "Where were you last night?" She's like, "I was here." He's like, "I was here. You brought me this ring." And he's like, "But where were you the rest of the night?" And then he goes on to tell her the test that was supposed to happen that day was canceled because another champion was found dead. And it was Xavier, and his body was half eaten. And she's like, "You don't think it was me, do you?" And he was like, "I hope it wasn't." So then Selena's thinking, this is a pattern. So Kale leaves, and she's like, "I'm going back to bed." So then she locks the door, and she actually goes down into the tomb. So she searches and searches, and she can't find anything down there. Then she comes back upstairs, and she's on her way to the library, and she's got some guards with her, but they round this corner, and she hears men arguing. Then she comes up on the crime scene, and there's like blood smeared on the walls, and it looks like someone had like taken the blood and written word marks. So at this point, there's 16 champions left. So then these two are jealous of each other, and they argue about each other being in her room the night before. And Kale was like, "Why were you in there?" And Dorian's like, "Well, I could ask the same of you." Then it jumps to Selena and Nehemia, and they're talking about the clock tower and the gargoyles, and Selena's like, "Do you think they move?" And she's like, "They're stone." Then she asks about, the word marks, and Nehemia's just kind of like blowing her off, like, why are you so interested in this? So then Kane and his little lackey boy show up, and they like start running their mouths and stuff, and Kane kind of leans in and lets her know, like, "I know who you are. I know where you've been." And so then they end up leaving. These the two girls leave. So then later on, these two are watching Celaena train, and they're kind of like discussing her chances of winning. And so they discuss her chances of winning, and like she's been helping Nox train ever since they started forming a friendship, and Dorian does not like this. And Chaol's like, just let her train, like she doesn't have anybody else, you know, to train with or whatever. And so Dorian is kind of jealous that she's been hanging out with Nox. So a few days later, Celaena and Chaol are in the library, and she's like looking into the word marks in books and stuff. So they end up talking about how, you know, like she's looking into the word marks and stuff, and he's like, why are you looking into this at all? And she's like, I just find it interesting. She says, some theories suggest that the mother goddess is just a spirit from one of these other worlds, and that she strayed through something called a word gate and found Aurelia in need of form and life. There's an idea that before the goddess arrived, there was life, an ancient civilization, but somehow they disappeared. Perhaps through that word gate thing. Ruins exist, ruins too old to be of Fae making. We learned that the gates are both real and invisible. Humans can't see them, but word marks can summon them. And then she's like sitting there just thinking like, where else can I look? And then a book appears, and it's called The Walking Dead, which if you've read ACOTAR, that book appears in there too. So she starts reading this The Walking Dead book, and it's kind of like freaking her out a little bit. Well, then all of a sudden she hears like a scraping and like claws on the floor, and she's like, what is that? Do you hear that? And Chaol starts laughing, and he was taking his dagger and scraping it on the floor just to freak her out. So then later on, Celaena's bored. She's attempting to play pool up in her rooms, and she's not having much luck with it. So Dorian comes in and decides to pull the oldest trick in the book, and let me show you how to shoot pool. They end up playing until 2 a.m. and then they sit and talk until she's like dozing off, and then he picks her up and goes and puts her in bed. Then the next day they have a test and they have to spar. So Celaena is placed with Varen, which is Kane's little lackey boy, and she basically just kicks his ass immediately. Like, it barely takes her time at all. She ends up kind of thinking about Sam a little bit, and then we jump to Kaltain, and she's talking to the queen about Dorian. The queen says, it's too bad that you didn't meet Dorian before you met Duke Parrington. So then she's thinking like, maybe I do have a chance if the queen would approve of me. Later on, Celaena is training archery with Chaol, and she's kind of off, and he's like, what's going on? And she ends up telling him that Kane knows who she is. So while they're talking about this, two guards come running over and like, Captain, we need you right now. There's another murder. So they go running, and it turns out it's Varen. There's marks gouged in the ground, and there's word marks again. And Celaena notices that the marks in the ground, there's no blood in them. So it sharpened its claws on the concrete or on the stone before it like gutted him. So why didn't he turn away? Why didn't he run or whatever? And they decide that someone that he knew had to have sliced his ankles and basically disabled him. While he was laying there unable to do anything, the creature came and got him. So Celaena's reading. Dorian comes to see her. He ends up telling her that one of his dogs had pups, and that, so then they're kind of like asking each other questions, trying to get to know each other better. She ends up asking him why he's not married yet, and he's like, because I'm only 19, like, you know, I don't want to be married yet. And so then she's like realizing that she likes him. While this is going on, we jump to Chaol, and he's at dinner, and he's noticing something weird is going on with Duke Parrington. And he's kind of watching him, and then he notices that there's kind of like a cloud that films over his eyes every once in a while. Celaena ends up waking up, and Elena is in her room, and she's basically there telling her, like reminding her, you have to win this competition. And she ends up telling her, look to your right, the answers you need will be there. So the next day she has her test, and basically all these champions, they have to arrange, there's like glasses in front of them, they have to arrange the poisons in order of least poisonous to most poisonous. So she gets down to these last two cups, and one just smells like wine, and then another one just smells and looks like water, and she's just like, I don't know which one's which. So Selena looks to her right and she remembers, oh yeah, Pillar said his specialty is in poisons. So he kind of like gives her this little nod and he places the wine least poisonous and the water most poisonous. So they go down the line of everybody and she's one of the last ones to go, but they make them drink the one that they think is least poisonous. So they keep having to hand out antidotes because like nobody got it right. So he goes to Selena and she carefully drinks the wine and she's fine. She got it right. And then he moves on to Pelor and of course he got it right too. So these two are the only ones that actually accomplished this task. So these two are hanging out again. Nehemia knows that she's keeping secrets, and she can't get her to tell him. So she ends up taking her to the kennels, and they run into Dorian. So they end up looking at the pups that his dog had, and he's talking about how one is not responsive to humans. It's like it doesn't listen and stuff. It's like very like standoffish. It doesn't want anything to do with them. And he says that they're gonna put it down. And she's like, no, don't put it down. Like, work with it. And he's like, well, it's no good to us if it can't be around humans. And she's like, well, I'll take it. And he ends up promising not to kill it. And so then like they flirt a little bit. And then she like goes to go back to her rooms and she ends up running into Cain and he's like got his hand around his throat. He's like choking himself and she's like, what the hell? And he's like being really weird and she's like, Cain? And he doesn't answer. He just keeps like choking himself and then he runs off. So then we jump to Kaltain, who has an opium addiction, and so she's smoking and she's talking about how she's been getting these headaches and she does the opium to help with the headaches. So Duke Parrington comes to visit her, and so then she's like trying to like blow all the smoke around and she's like trying to fresh her breath up and everything. And so then these two talk about Lady Lillian, which is Selena, and how they need to protect Dorian from her because they think that she's lying about her past, which Duke Parrington knows, but Kaltain has been suspecting, and there's been rumors going around. Selena's she's researching the word marks again, and she's in her rooms and stuff, and Nehemia comes up and she's just like all panicky and she's freaking out. And Selena's like, what's going on? And Nehemia tells her that the king and his armies killed 500 Elway rebels. They were taking them to Calicola, which is another prison camp. And I guess some of them like tried to get loose or something and they ended up just like killing them all. So then the next day, Chaol comes to get Selena and she's laying in bed and she's just like, in so much pain. And we find out her periods had come back. So all this time that she was so like starved and stuff from being in the prison camp, like they stopped. So now that she's eaten and she's getting in better shape, they've come back with a vengeance. So she's in a lot of pain, and Chaol comes in and she's like, Chaol, and then just pukes all over his feet. And so he's like, man, you really are sick. And eventually she tells him like it's that time of the month, and he like gets super embarrassed and he leaves. So then I guess on his way out, he runs into Dorian, and so Dorian comes in laughing, and he's like, you would think that he'd be used to blood and like, whatever, no big deal. So Dorian's hanging out and she's just like, leave me alone, go away, I'm in pain, I don't want company. And then he just sits and keeps talking and bothering her. He's like, well, what if I read you a story? and he picks up the book that she's been reading, and he's like, how do you read this crap? And it's a romance novel. And she's like, well, I tried to get Kale to read it and he won't read it. So then Dorian's like, give that back. And so he takes it back from her, and he's like, you know, he's determined to read it now since Kale won't read it, because they've got this little feud going on where they're both in love with her but both denying it. So they end up flirting a little bit, and he tells her, like, you must really hate me for what my family has done to your home and everything. And he says that he doesn't want to be like his dad. And he ends up admitting that the reason he chose her as his champion was to kind of get back at his dad. So she ends up telling him she doesn't hate him. And then he tells her all about the Yulmus ball and how fancy and it's a masked ball and everything, but she's not allowed to go. So, like, why even bring it up if you're not going to let her go? So then he gets ready to leave, and he, like, kisses her on the cheek and then leaves, and she's just all like, oh, he kissed me. So the next day, Kale is, like, up on balconies and stuff, and he's spying as Dorian and Celaena, like, take a walk through the courtyard. So Kale says that it scares him more that he trusts her than it does that she's with Dorian. So then we cut to Celaena and Dorian, and they're walking through the courtyard, and we learn that it's been 3 weeks since Elena came to visit her. So there's been 3 more tests since then. One of them was an obstacle course. Pellar was sent home, but 3 more competitors have turned up dead. So there's only 6 of them left now, and it's Kane, Grave, Knox, 1 soldier, a guy named Renault, and Celaena. Dorian ends up asking her about her necklace, which is the Eye of Elena, and she says that she found it in her jewelry box and she liked it, and so she put it on. So he tells her that it looks like the Eye of Elena, which was a magical amulet that was given to Elena by a spirit, and that Erewhon, which was the evil at the time that she was around, couldn't touch her. So that Elena and Gavin slew Erewhon, and the necklace has been missing for centuries since then. So then later on, Celaena's reading in bed, which she does a lot, and then Philippa comes in and scares the crap out of her, and she drops her book on the floor. So she gets down to pick it up, and it had kind of like rolled under the bed. So she goes to get it out from under the bed, and she notices there's like chalk word marks all over underneath her bed. And she like freaks out, and she scrubs them off immediately. So then later, she goes to the library at like midnight, and she finds Nehemia in there reading, and she's like, that's kind of sus, because like I've been trying to teach her how to read and she ain't at that reading level yet. So in the perfect common tongue, Nehemia says basically like, if you didn't think that I could read at that level, then you're like every ignorant fool in this castle, Lillian. And then she leaves, and then Celaena ends up finding a paper where she was sitting at with a word mark on it. And so she picks it up and puts it in her pocket. So then days pass. She hasn't seen Nehemia. She wakes up Yulmus morning, and she finds candy on her bed. So she starts shoveling it in her face. She ends up with red teeth, and we find out she's talking to Philippa, and she ends up saying, like, my grandson eats better than you. And so we find out she has a grandson. So then Dorian comes to visit her, and he's the one that gave her all the candy, and he's like, man, you ate it all? Like, you didn't save any for me? Like, I wanted some. So then he brings her another present, and so that other present is a puppy. So the one that he was going to kill, he ends up bringing it to her as a present. So that when she's training, she wants the pup training with all the other dogs. Dorian agrees to that, and like he tells her that he'll see her after the ball. So then she gets thinking, like, she's suspicious of Nehemia at this point, thinking that she's the one that's killed all these men. So she's like, well, what if she unleashes that beast at the ball? So she decides to infiltrate the ball and ask Philippa to get her a dress and a mask. Celaena and Chaol end up going to this like religious ceremony for Yulmus, and she falls asleep. Chaol wakes her up. He was sleeping a little bit too, and was kind of embarrassed about it. So then the end of the ceremony, part of the tradition is little kids dress up as their gods and goddesses, and then they're blindfolded and they walk around, and wherever the god or goddess leads them, they give the token that they have to that person. And so Celaena ends up getting the goddess Diana, which is the huntress and protector of the young, and she kind of hands it to Chaol, and she's like, I don't want it. And he's like, I don't want to anger the gods, and hands it back to her. So later that night, Celaena's gotten this beautiful dress and mask and everything, and she ends up going to the ball by having Philippa help her trick the guards into thinking that Dorian invited her. So as soon as she walks in, Dorian and Chaol spot her, and they're both like, what is she doing here? So Chaol ends up making it to her first and pulls her aside, and then they kind of hang out for a while and kind of standing on the edge of the dance floor, and she's just bored out of her mind. She's watching Nehemia the whole time. Well, Nehemia finally gets up and comes over and says hi to him basically, and then she says that I'm not feeling well, I'm going to take my leave. After she leaves, Celaena feels like she can relax a little bit, so she asks Chaol to dance. And he's like, no, Parrington's right there, because at this point he's suspecting Parrington, and he's like, Parrington's right there, he's already mad enough that you're here, don't draw attention to yourself. Then Dorian comes up and asks her to dance, and well, he asks like, why aren't you guys dancing? And then that's when Chaol's like, we don't want to draw too much attention. So Dorian asked her to dance, and so they dance for a lot of songs, which is like frowned upon for the prince to dance with like one person for that long. So Chaol is watching them, and he's like all jealous and stuff, and this random courtier that we never really hear about again, he kind of comes up, and basically he's like, so I thought you were with her, but is she with him then? And Chaol's like, no, neither one of us is with her. And he's like, that's funny, because it looks like Dorian's in love with her. Miss Kaltain is watching, and she's jealous that Celaena's dancing with Dorian the whole time. Celaena finally slips away from the ball at 3 a.m. and when like Dorian goes to get a drink, so she slips out, and by the time she makes it to her room, Dorian's standing at her door waiting on her. So they go in to her rooms, they end up kissing, and she kind of like does this like duck and slips under him and slips into a door. So then she's like, good night. And so then we learn there's a test in 2 days. So she sleeps in after the ball, and then Dorian comes to visit her. She decides to name the pup Fleetfoot, and they kind of talk about the kiss, and she tries to deflect. She's like, well, it's not that I liked it, but it's not that I didn't like it, and you know, that kind of thing. Then we jump to Kaltain and Parrington, and they're talking about Lillian, and basically Duke Parrington ends up telling her about Celaena and that she's really Otterlin's assassin. He gets Kaltain in on his plan to poison Celaena before the final duel. Then we jump back to Celaena, and she's figured out that someone's using the word mark to summon a demon, and she's found out that the word marks exist outside of magic, and you know, because magic is gone. And so then she's still suspicious of Nehemia, but she's like less suspicious of her now. So she ends up going into the tunnels, and she hears a man chanting, and it turns out to be Cain, which duh, if you didn't see that one coming. So Cain summons the demon, or what they call a Ritterak. And so it's gray, hairless, with black fangs, vaguely human body, long front arms, and dark eyes. So I used AI art for all of this because I didn't want to steal anybody's like fan art. So I used AI art for all this, and I tried to do a picture of the Ritterak, and no matter what I did, like, it turned out awful. So I just didn't do a picture of it, but it's this evil demon creature. So she ends up, he kind of like locks her in there with the demon, and she tricks it into running through the door back to the stairwell, and so it smashes it down, and she runs and she goes to Elena's tomb. So she makes it in there, and she gets Demarius, the sword, off of the sarcophagus, and she drives it through the Ritterak's head. She staggers up the stairs, and she's like passing out, and when she gets back to her rooms, Nehemia finds her. So she's out, wakes up later, and she's all healed, but she has like a scar of a bite mark kind of like right here on her hand, but it's all healed. So she ends up telling Nehemia the truth about who she is and like what she's doing there. Nehemia ends up giving her the name Elentia, which means spirit that could not be broken. So Celaena tells her how she became Adarlan's assassin, and then we end up jumping to Chaol and Celaena taking a walk. She's like, why am I not in trouble for going to the ball? And he basically, like, you know, she's like, why am I not being watched 24/7 anymore? And he's basically like, well, I trust that you're not going anywhere now. But then he ends up lecturing her about her and Dorian getting involved, and she's like, yeah. As they're walking down the hall, they run into the king, and he's returned from his trip. So she kind of freezes. They find out that the king returned alone, and everyone else in his party is dead. So Chaol's like going over the reports and stuff, and he's like, why? Like, how did this happen? And he's like, I know he's keeping stuff from me, like, but I'm his captain, like, he should be telling me these things. At this point, there's 5 champions left. There's 1 test left before the duel. So she ends up talking to Nox. She warns him to leave, that there's like danger and stuff, and he figures out who she is and kind of just processes of elimination, and like he asks, like, if you were an assassin, like, is it somebody that I would know of? And she was like, yeah. So he's like, but you're just a girl. So then later on, he ends up leaving in the middle of the night. Then we jump back to Kaltain, and they're at dinner. She's high again. She's tripping, seeing like shadows and wings, and hearing wings flapping and stuff, and it's all around Cain. And she's like, what's wrong with me? So then we jump to Celaena and Dorian, and they're playing chess. You know, they've been hanging out a lot and stuff, and so she's decided she's not telling him about the demon. But they end up holding hands, and they kiss, and like they make out and talk until like 3 a.m. So then she wakes up later, and she has a nightmare about being a young girl and like being chased through like the woods and stuff, and like up to the river, and then she wakes up. So then we jump to the day of the test. So it's before everything starts, and Parrington and Kaltain are standing there, and she's got the poison kind of like up her sleeve and stuff, and he like leans in to talk to her, so she leans over and pours the poison into Celaena's drink. So then we learn that the rules are supposed to be that you trap your opponent in a position that is sure for death, but no further, so you can't actually kill him. So Cain ends up dueling Renault, and he takes him out in 3 minutes. So then Celaena duels Grave, and it takes her 2 minutes to knock him on his butt. So then Celaena and Cain end up getting the wine, and they drink the wine, and Kaltain does this whole little spiel about how may the goddess protect him, blah, 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 blah. So then the king like immediately makes them fight right after they drink. And so she starts feeling like she's fuzzy and slow, and she just keeps slowing down. Her vision's blurry and stuff. She figures out that they poisoned her with bloodbane. Kane's beating her up pretty good, and he's kind of toying with her. He ends up dislocating her shoulder and then like throws her into the clock tower, and then it slams back into place. So Dorian and Chaol can't interfere or she can be disqualified. Kane ends up revealing that he knows how her parents died, and she's like, how in the hell does he know that? So she's like down on the edge of their like fighting ring, and Chaol is on the side there like outside the line, and he's like, get up, get up, get up. And so she's like seeing stuff. She's seeing creatures all around Kane and shadows, and she's just like, she thinks she's about to die. So Kane ends up ripping the Eye of Elena off of her neck, and he's kind of still slowly toying with her and stuff. So Nehemia comes over, and she's kind of like doing weird stuff with her hands, and she does some word marks to help call for help. And so Elena comes and ends up helping her fight off the demons and stuff. And so then all of a sudden, Celaena, on her forehead, this like symbol mark ends up glowing bright blue. She ends up getting up, and then she's picked up half of the staff that she had, and she stabs Kane in the side. So she wins, and they declare her the winner. And then as she's laying there or standing there, Kane comes over and he tries to like stab her in the back. When Chaol sees him coming for her after she's already been declared the winner, he ends up going and stabbing Kane and killing him. So Celaena gets taken to the healers, and Miss Kaltain here doesn't know when to keep her mouth shut, and she ends up telling him, like, I thought you told me this poison was gonna work. And he's like, poison? Poison? What poison? You poisoned her? And she's like, you gave it to me. What are you talking about? And so then they end up arresting her, and she's taken to the dungeons. And then we find out in the next chapter that Chaol will not be punished for killing Kane, kind of self-defense, whatever. And then we learned that the king will get her contract ready just whenever he's ready to do it, basically. Nehemia comes to talk to her. They kind of share some more secrets. She ends up giving her the Eye of Elena back. She said that one of her guards picked it up off the ground. A little later, Dorian comes to check on her. We jump to the king and Duke Parrington plotting, and they're talking about experimenting with Kane and Kaltain, and they've been doing some kind of experiments on them and to like control them and see how strong they can get and that kind of stuff. But it doesn't say exactly what it is. So then a week later, Chaol finally comes to check on her, and she's like, where have you been? I haven't seen you in a week. Like, are you okay? And so like they talk about his first kill and stuff, and he's kind of like depressed about it and whatever. Well, then Dorian shows up, so Chaol leaves. Dorian ends up telling her that she's to sign her contract the next day. So she's like, well, I wish Chaol wouldn't have taken off, because like I'm excited for him to know that. But while they're talking, she ends up breaking things off with him, because she's like, if I'm going to be the king's champion, then like this isn't going to work with us. And like, you're the prince, I'm the king's champion, like we can't do this. Later on, Chaol's looking for Dorian, can't find him, so he goes to Celaena's room looking for him, and Celaena's like, he's not here, you probably won't find him here again because I broke things off with him. Chaol's glad about. So then later on, Celaena has a dream about Elena again, We find out that Elena was a warrior. She wasn't like a helpless maiden like the stories make her sound, and she fought alongside Gavin. And then she tells Celaena that her people and her friends need her, and blood ties cannot be broken. So then the final chapter, Celaena goes and signs the contract with the king, and her and Chaol go walking, and he's like, do you want to know what your first contract is? And she's like, tell me tomorrow. So then after that is where Crown of Midnight picks up. So here in another week or so, I'll have that video ready for you. So if you like this content, if you want to see the rest of the series, subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you next time.